Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Travel Stories. Tonight, we're going to walk together through one of the most extraordinary places on Earth. We're going to experience Pompeii, that ancient Roman city frozen in time. But we're going to see it in a way that few visitors ever do. We're going to walk through its streets at dawn, when the first light of morning touches the ancient stones, when the shadows are long and the air is still cool, when the sight is quiet and peaceful and you can almost hear the whispers of the past carried on the Mediterranean breeze. This is a place I've dreamed of visiting for as long as I can remember. The very name Pompeii conjures images of a city caught in mid-breath, a moment suspended across nearly 2,000 years. And so, as we begin this journey together, I want you to imagine that you're there with me, experiencing it for the first time, feeling that mixture of excitement and reverence that comes with standing in a place where history feels not just visible, but almost alive. We'll take our time tonight. There's no rush. We'll wander slowly through the Forum as morning light spills across its ancient columns. We'll peer into houses where families once laughed and argued and went about their daily lives. We'll walk streets worn smooth by chariot wheels and feet that ceased to tread them in the year 79. And throughout it all, we'll feel the presence of Mount Vesuvius watching over everything, just as it did then, just as it does now. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our walk through Pompeii at dawn. Approaching Pompeii. The night before visiting Pompeii, sleep comes in fits and starts. There's an anticipation that keeps pulling you back to wakefulness. The knowledge that tomorrow morning you'll walk streets that haven't been walked by their intended inhabitants in almost 2 millennia. When the alarm sounds at 4:30 in the morning, darkness still blankets the world outside, but you're already awake. The drive to Pompeii from Naples takes you along roads that wind through the Campanian countryside, even in darkness. As you leave the city behind, the landscape begins to shift, and though you can't see much detail in the pre-dawn gloom, you can sense the change. The air coming through the slightly opened window carries different scents now, hints of volcanic soil and the Mediterranean that lies not far to the west, and that particular quality of air that exists only in southern Italy, something warm and ancient, even in the cool hours before sunrise. The road itself follows a route that has existed in various forms for thousands of years. The Romans were master road builders, and the major routes they constructed throughout their empire often followed even more ancient paths, trade routes, and migration corridors that had been used for millennia, while the modern highway you're traveling has been paved and widened and improved beyond anything the Romans knew. It still follows the basic geography that determined where roads could and should go, threading through the same valleys and around the same obstacles that ancient travelers navigated. Through the car window, you catch glimpses of the landscape beginning to reveal itself in the pre-dawn light. Vineyards climb gentle slopes, their vines still dormant in the cool season, or showing the first hints of spring growth. These are the descendants of the same vines that grew here in Roman times, producing wine from volcanic soil that gives the grapes a distinctive mineral character. The wine produced in this region today, still sometimes marketed under the ancient name Lacrima Christi, continues a viticultural tradition that stretches back unbroken across 2,000 years. Small villages dot the landscape, their lights beginning to flicker on as residents wake to begin their days. Many of these villages stand on sites that have been continuously inhabited since ancient times, their locations chosen for access to water, fertile soil, and transportation routes that remain relevant today. The continuity of settlement in this region is remarkable, a reminder that geography and human needs create patterns that persist across vast stretches of time. Pompeii sits on the Campanian plain, roughly 14 miles southeast of Naples, in a region that has been shaped by volcanic forces for hundreds of thousands of years. The city was built on a spur formed by prehistoric lava flows, a slight elevation that gave it both strategic advantages and ultimately a front row seat to its own destruction. To the immediate north looms Mount Vesuvius, and even though you can't see it yet in the darkness, you know it's there. You can feel its presence, that silent giant that dominates the landscape, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. As you draw closer to the archaeological site, the sky begins its slow transformation from black to the deepest blue. It's that magical time just before dawn, when the world holds its breath, when darkness is losing its grip, but daylight hasn't quite arrived. The modern town of Pompeii, with its single eye, sleeps around you. Streetlights cast their amber glow on empty streets. A few early workers are beginning their days, but mostly the world is still and quiet. You park in a small lot near the Porta Marina entrance, one of the original city gates. Stepping out of the car, the first thing you notice is the temperature. Even though this is the warmest part of Italy, dawn brings a surprising coolness, especially in spring or autumn. The air feels fresh, carrying that pre-dawn crispness that makes you pull your jacket a little closer. But there's warmth in it too, the promise of the Mediterranean sun that will arrive in just a short while. The second thing you notice is the silence. There are no crowds yet, no tour buses rumbling in the parking areas, no guides gathering groups with their multicolored flags held high. Just silence, and somewhere in the distance, the song of early birds greeting the coming day. Walking toward the entrance, your footsteps echo slightly. The ticket office is just opening, and the attendant offers a quiet good morning, perhaps surprised to see someone so early. But they understand. People who come to Pompeii at dawn are a particular type of visitor. They're not here to check it off a list or to say they've seen it. They're here to feel it, to connect with it, to stand in the presence of something that transcends ordinary tourism. You pass through the gate, and then you're inside. You're in Pompeii. The first few steps are almost overwhelming. Even in the dim light, even without being able to see everything clearly yet, you can sense the vastness of this place. The modern pathway leads upward, ascending the ancient street that connects the Porta Marina to the Forum. Your eyes are still adjusting to the low light, but shapes are beginning to emerge. Walls, columns, the distinctive outline of Roman arches, everything is rendered in shades of blue and grey by the pre-dawn light. The eastern sky is growing lighter now. It's not yet sunrise, but that absolute darkness has given way to a luminous quality that allows you to see the basic forms around you. Vesuvius is becoming visible, a dark silhouette against the gradually brightening sky. The mountain rises in that characteristic shape, the truncated cone that marks where its summit once stood before the eruption that destroyed this city. Even from here, you can see how it dominates everything, how it would have been the backdrop to every day of life in ancient Pompeii. The path beneath your feet is original Roman paving, blocks of dark volcanic stone fitted together with a precision that has lasted 2,000 years. They're uneven now, worn by time and the footsteps of millions of visitors. But originally, these would have been smooth and level, an engineering achievement that allowed easy movement of people, carts, and animals through the city. As you climb toward the Forum, the sky continues its transformation. The deep blue is giving way to lighter shades, and just on the eastern horizon, the first hints of pink and gold are beginning to appear. Birds are singing more loudly now, their morning chorus filling the air. The swallows that nest in the ruins are beginning to dart through the ancient spaces, their movements quick and joyful. You reach the top of the incline, and suddenly the forum opens before you, and you stop because there are no words for this moment. The forum, heart of ancient life. The Forum of Pompeii, seen at dawn, is something that photographs can never capture. It's something you have to feel with all your senses. And standing here now, as the first rays of sunlight are just beginning to touch the top of Vesuvius, you understand why people have been making this pilgrimage for hundreds of years since the excavations began. The Forum is a vast rectangular space measuring approximately 157 meters long by 38 meters wide. In modern terms, it's about the length of 1.5 football fields. But these measurements don't convey what it feels like to stand here. The space feels both intimate and monumental, designed on a human scale, but executed with a grandeur that speaks to the importance this place held in the life of ancient Pompeii. Around the perimeter, columns rise into the lightning sky. Many are broken now. They're all tops missing, but enough remain to give you a sense of what this place once looked like. These columns supported a 2-story colonnade that would have enclosed the forum on all sides, creating a sheltered walkway where people could walk in shade during the heat of the day or shelter from rain. The columns are made of volcanic stone, originally covered with white stucco that would have gleamed in the Mediterranean sun. Now that stucco has mostly fallen away, revealing the dark volcanic rock underneath, but in places, you can still see traces of the white covering, ghosts of the forum's former glory. The construction of these columns reveals Roman engineering skill in fascinating detail. Each column is not carved from a single piece of stone, but built up from cylindrical sections called drums that were stacked one atop another. The joints between drums are so precisely cut that you can barely slip a knife blade between them, and the columns have stood for 2,000 years without mortar or metal pins to hold the sections together. The weight of the upper sections provides all the binding force necessary, a testament to the precision of Roman stone cutting. Looking closely at the column bases, you notice they're not all identical. Some are simple, others more elaborate, with different moldings and profiles that suggest they were added or replaced at different times in the forum's history. This architectural variation tells a story of continuous modification and improvement, of successive generations adding their own touches to this central civic space. Between the columns, statue bases once held bronze or marble sculptures of emperors, gods, and local benefactors. Most of these statues are long gone, removed by looters or damaged beyond recognition. But the bases remain, and many still bear their inscriptions. Walking along the colonnade, reading these inscriptions in the growing morning light, you're reading a who's who of ancient Pompeii, the names of the wealthy and powerful who shaped the city's development and who sought immortality through public monuments. The pavement beneath your feet is travertine, a type of limestone that was laid during the reign of Augustus, replacing an earlier surface of volcanic tufa. The stones are large and carefully fitted, and walking on them, you're walking on the same surface that ancient Pompeians walked on when they came here to conduct business, to worship at the temples, to hear announcements from magistrates, to meet friends, to gossip and argue and live their public lives. As dawn light spreads across the forum, the first warm rays of sun touch the columns along the eastern side, and suddenly those ancient stones glow with a golden light that seems to come from within them. The contrast between the sunlit columns and the deep blue shadows that still pool on the western side creates a dramatic interplay of light and dark. And for a moment, it's easy to imagine this place as it was, filled with people going about their morning business. At the northern end of the forum, dominating the entire space, stands the Temple of Jupiter. Even in its ruined state, even with its roof gone and its columns broken, the temple maintains an imposing presence. It sits on a high podium that raises it above the level of the forum, and approaching it means climbing a flight of steps that makes you physically ascend to reach the sacred space. The temple was dedicated to the Capitoline Triad: Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the three most important deities in the Roman state religion. Built in the 2nd century BC, around 150 years before the eruption, the temple symbolized Rome's dominance over Pompeii. Before Roman conquest, the primary deity worshipped in Pompeii had been Apollo. But the construction of this massive temple to Jupiter made a clear statement about who now held power here. The podium measures 37 meters by 17 meters, and it originally supported a temple with 6 columns across the front and probably 13 down each side. Standing before it now, looking up at the remaining fragments of columns and the massive foundation, you can imagine how impressive this would have been, how it would have caught the eye of anyone entering the forum, how its sheer size and position would have communicated power and permanence. Behind the temple, Vesuvius rises in perfect alignment with the central axis of the sacred building. This wasn't accidental. The temple was deliberately oriented so that It framed the mountain, incorporating it into the religious and civic architecture of the city. Standing here now, with the sun just beginning to illuminate the mountain slopes, you can see this alignment clearly, and it sends a shiver through you. The mountain that was incorporated into the spiritual geography of the city was the same mountain that would destroy it. The light is growing stronger now, and details are becoming visible that were hidden in the dawn shadows. Along the sides of the forum, you can see the bases of statues that once stood here, honorific monuments to emperors, local magistrates, and benefactors who had earned the gratitude of the city. The statues themselves are gone, removed to museums or lost to time. But the bases remain, many still bearing inscriptions that record names and achievements from 2,000 years ago. On the eastern side of the forum stands the Macellum, the covered market where meat, fish, and other foodstuffs were sold. The structure is recognizable by its central colonnade, which would have surrounded a fountain or pool where fish could be kept fresh. The floor still shows remnants of its original mosaic decoration, geometric patterns in black and white that would have been easier to keep clean than more elaborate designs. This was a working space, a place of commerce and bustle, and the practical nature of its decoration reflects that. Walking through the Macellum as morning light filters through its ruined walls, you can almost smell the ghost of fish and meat, almost hear the calls of vendors and the haggling of customers. Along the walls, small rooms open off the main market space. These would have been shops or storage areas, places where individual merchants could keep their goods or conduct their business. In some of these rooms, frescoes still cling to the walls, faded now but showing scenes of food and abundance, advertising the plenty that could be found here. Next to the Macellum stands the Temple of the Lares Publici, a sanctuary dedicated to the protective deities of the city and to the deified Emperor Augustus. This temple has a poignant history. It was under construction when Vesuvius erupted, built as an act of penance after the earthquake of 62 AD that had damaged much of the city. The people of Pompeii believed that the earthquake had been a sign of the gods' displeasure, and they were attempting to appease these divine forces when the volcano erupted. The temple was never completed. Standing before it now, seeing the unfinished walls, you're confronted with time stopped in mid-action, plans interrupted forever. On the western side of the forum, occupying a prominent position, is the Basilica. This is one of the oldest buildings in Pompeii, constructed around 120 BC, and it's one of the finest examples of a Roman basilica anywhere in the ancient world. The building served as the center for legal and economic activities, a place where trials were held and business deals concluded. Entering the basilica as morning light streams through its eastern openings, you walk into a space that still conveys a sense of grandeur. The main hall is divided into a nave and two side aisles by rows of columns, and at the far end, a raised tribunal would have provided a platform for judges and magistrates. The columns are massive, and standing next to one, you have to crane your neck to see where it ends, or rather, where it breaks off into empty air. The walls of the basilica still show traces of stucco decoration that was designed to imitate marble blocks, a common technique that allowed builders to achieve a luxurious appearance at less expense than using real marble. In the growing light, you can see the lines and patterns that created this illusion, and it's remarkable how effective the trompe-l'œil technique was. On one wall, you notice something that makes you smile. Among the stucco decoration, someone in ancient times has scratched graffiti. It's faint now, worn by time, but you can make out words in Latin. This was one of the idlers who hung around the basilica hoping for work, perhaps a lawyer without clients or a teacher without students. And in a moment of boredom or frustration, they carved their presence into the wall. 2,000 years later, their graffiti remains, a voice from the past that speaks directly to you. Leaving the basilica and walking back into the forum, the sun is now well above the horizon, and the entire space is bathed in warm morning light. The shadows have mostly retreated, and you can see the forum clearly now, in all its ruined glory. It's still early enough that you have the place almost to yourself. Perhaps one or two other early visitors have arrived, or a guard making his rounds, but the crowds are still hours away. You walk to the center of the forum and simply stand there, turning slowly in a circle, taking it all in. To the north, the Temple of Jupiter with Vesuvius behind it. To the east, the Mausoleum and other civic buildings. To the south, the administrative buildings where the city's government conducted its business. To the west, the Basilica and the Temple of Apollo. This was the heart of Pompeii, the place where public life unfolded, where the threads of religion, commerce, law, and politics all wove together. In the pavement, you notice something interesting. There are no wheel ruts here. The forum was pedestrian only, closed to carts and chariots. The Romans understood the value of creating spaces dedicated solely to human movement and interaction, free from the noise and chaos of wheeled traffic. Standing here in the quiet of dawn, you can appreciate that ancient urban planning, the thoughtfulness that went into creating a space where people could gather and interact without the intrusion of vehicles. The sun is warm on your face now, and the coolness of dawn is giving way to the gentle heat that will build through the morning. The stones under your feet, which were cool when you arrived, are beginning to warm. The swallows are flying in their complex patterns overhead, and somewhere in the distance you can hear a rooster crowing, its call carrying across the ruins from one of the farms that border the archaeological site. Before leaving the Forum, you walk to its southern end, where a series of administrative buildings house the offices of the city's government. Here, the Duumviri, Pompeii's two chief magistrates, would have conducted their business. Here, the city council met to debate and make decisions. Here, laws were recorded and archives maintained. The buildings are simpler than the temples and the basilica, reflecting their practical function. But they're no less important to understanding how this city worked. And here too, there's graffiti. On one wall, someone has scratched a date, October 3rd, along with the names of 2 Roman consuls. This was how Romans dated events, by reference to who held the consulship in that year. This little inscription was probably made by a clerk or official, marking some routine piece of business that seemed important at the time, but which is now lost to history. What remains is just this date, this moment, preserved on a wall 2,000 years later. The Forum at dawn is magical, but there's so much more to see, and the morning is advancing. You take one last look around this magnificent space, committing it to memory, and then you turn toward the Temple of Apollo, ready to continue your walk through this extraordinary city. Sacred spaces and temples. The Temple of Apollo occupies a prominent position on the western side of the Forum, and approaching it from the Forum entrance, you step into a space that's older than most of what surrounds it. This sanctuary dates back to the 6th century BC, making it one of the most ancient religious sites in Pompeii. Before Rome, before the city became a thriving commercial center, when Pompeii was still under the cultural influence of the Greeks and Etruscans, people were already worshipping Apollo here. The sanctuary is enclosed by a colonnade, and stepping through the entrance is like passing from one world into another. The noise and bustle of the Forum fades, and you enter a sacred precinct that was designed for contemplation and worship. The courtyard is surrounded by 48 columns, originally painted in bright colors that would have created a vivid contrast against the white walls. Now the colors have mostly faded, but in places, especially in protected corners, you can still see traces of red and yellow pigment, ghosts of the sanctuary's original appearance. In the center of the courtyard, raised on a high podium, stands the temple itself. Like the temple of Jupiter, it's in ruins now, its roof gone and many of its columns broken. But the basic form is still clear. 6 columns across the front, 13 down each side, all in the Corinthian order, with their characteristic acanthus leaf capitals. The temple faces the rising sun, a deliberate orientation that would have allowed the morning light to stream directly into the sacred space. At the base of the temple steps, 2 bronze statues stand, or rather, copies of statues stand here, the originals having been removed to the Archaeological Museum in Naples for preservation. One depicts Apollo as an archer, his bow drawn, ready to loose an arrow. The other shows Diana, Apollo's twin sister, goddess of the hunt. The statues are beautiful, capturing the idealized human forms that characterized Greek and Roman religious art. But they're also slightly unnerving here in the dawn light. These metal figures standing eternal watch over a temple that has been dead for 2,000 years. Walking around the courtyard, you notice that the floor is not level. It slopes slightly toward the center, where there's a drainage system. This was practical architecture, designed to handle the rain that would fall in the open courtyard, channeling it away to prevent pooling and damage. But it's also aesthetically pleasing. The gentle slope creating visual interest and leading the eye naturally toward the temple at the center. Along the colonnade, bases indicate where other statues once stood, and inscriptions on some of these bases record dedications from worshippers, prayers for divine favor, thanks for prayers answered. One inscription, still clearly legible, records a gift from a wealthy woman named Eumachia, who was one of Pompeii's most prominent citizens. She was a priestess and a patroness of the city's fullers, the workers who cleaned and processed wool, and her generosity left its mark throughout Pompeii. As you walk through the sanctuary, you try to imagine what it would have been like to worship here. The Romans didn't practice religion the way we might think of it today. There were no weekly services, no sermons, no congregational worship. Instead, religion was transactional. a relationship between humans and gods based on mutual obligation. You offered sacrifice and prayer, and in return you expected divine favor. The temples were the houses of the gods, places where the divine and human worlds intersected, and entering them was an act that required proper respect and ritual. The morning light is now flooding the sanctuary, and the white stone of the temple glows almost painfully bright. The shadows cast by the columns create a pattern on the ground, bars of darkness and light that shift and move as the sun rises higher. A cat, one of the many that live among the ruins, emerges from behind a column base, stretches luxuriously, and then pads silently across the courtyard before disappearing through a gap in the wall. Leaving the Temple of Apollo, you make your way to the Temple of Fortuna Augusta, which stands on a different street away from the Forum. This temple was built much later than Apollo's sanctuary, commissioned around the beginning of the 1st century AD by a wealthy citizen named Marcus Tullius as a gift to the city. It's smaller than the other temples, more intimate, but no less carefully constructed. The temple sits at a corner, and its positioning was clearly chosen to make it visible from multiple streets. Approaching it now, you can see how it would have commanded attention, how its white marble facade would have stood out against the darker stone of the surrounding buildings. The front steps are steep, emphasizing the elevation of the sacred space above the mundane world of the street. Inside, or rather in what remains of the interior, you can see niches in the walls where statues of the emperor and other deities would have stood. The cult of Fortuna, the goddess of luck and fate, was popular in Pompeii, and combining her worship with that of the emperor was a common practice in the imperial period. It served both religious and political purposes, linking divine favor with loyalty to Rome. The temple is smaller and more damaged than some of the others, but standing in it at this early hour, with soft morning light filtering through the empty doorway and window openings, you feel a particular connection to this space. Perhaps it's the human scale of it, the sense that this was a neighborhood temple, a place where ordinary people came to pray for good fortune in their daily lives. Or perhaps it's simply the quality of light and shadow, the way the rising sun illuminates one wall while leaving the other in deep blue shadow, creating a dramatic interplay that no artificial lighting could replicate. As you continue your walk, you pass by smaller shrines and sacred spaces scattered throughout the city. The Romans believed that the divine was everywhere, not confined to temples alone, And so they built small shrines at street corners, in public squares, even in private homes. These shrines, called Lararia, were dedicated to the Lares, the protective spirits of place and family, and offerings would be made at them regularly to ensure continued divine protection. One particularly well-preserved lararium stands at a street corner, a small painted shrine showing the Lares as young men dancing with drinking horns, flanked by the genius of the paterfamilias, the protective spirit of the household head. The paint is faded now, but you can still make out the figures, and below them, a painted serpent, another protective symbol. Someone in the last days before the eruption would have stood here and made an offering, perhaps burning incense or leaving food, hoping for the gods' protection. The gods, it seems, had other plans. The presence of these sacred spaces throughout the city reminds you that for the Romans, religion wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into every aspect of existence, from the grand public temples where state rituals were performed, to these humble street shrines where ordinary people sought protection and favor. The gods were real and present, active in the world, and maintaining good relations with them was as important as maintaining good relations with your neighbors. But as you walk among these sacred spaces, seeing the temples fallen into ruin, the shrines empty of offerings, you can't help but reflect on the irony. All this devotion, all these prayers and sacrifices, all this careful attention to divine favor, and in the end, it couldn't save them. When Vesuvius erupted, the gods, if they existed, didn't intervene. The temples, the most sacred spaces in the city, were buried along with everything else. Their sanctity, no protection against volcanic fury. And yet, there's something moving about seeing these places now. Something that touches you despite or perhaps because of that failed protection. These ruins speak to a fundamental human need to connect with something greater than ourselves, to believe that the universe has meaning and order, that our prayers might be heard and answered. That need hasn't changed in 2,000 years. The forms have changed, the names of the gods are different, but the impulse is the same. The sun is higher now, well above the horizon, and the quality of light is changing from the soft, golden glow of early morning to the clearer, stronger light of full day. The shadows are shorter, the contrasts less dramatic. You can hear sounds in the distance now. The first voices of guards and early workers beginning to arrive. The hum of a vehicle somewhere outside the site boundaries. Your time alone with the ancient city is ending, and you feel both grateful for having had it and a little sad to lose it. But there's still so much to see, and you turn your steps toward the streets and houses where the real daily life of Pompeii unfolded. Streets and urban fabric. The Via dell'Abbondanza, Pompeii's main thoroughfare, stretches from the Forum eastward across the entire city, and walking it at this early hour, with the sun now well risen, but the crowds still absent, you begin to understand what made Roman urban planning so sophisticated and how a city like Pompeii actually functioned day to day. The street is paved with large blocks of volcanic stone, dark grey to black in colour, fitted together with remarkable precision. These aren't the carefully cut rectangular blocks you might expect. Instead, they're polygonal, their irregular edges fitted together like a puzzle, creating a surface that has lasted 2,000 years. The blocks are worn smooth. In the center of the street, where the traffic was heaviest, and deeply rutted, where the wheels of countless carts and chariots passed over them again and again throughout the centuries of the city's life. The ruts are fascinating to examine. They're not random, but run in parallel lines at a consistent gauge, the ancient equivalent of a railroad track. Carts and chariots were built to a standard width, and over time, their wheels wore grooves into the stone pavement, grooves that can still guide your fingers if you trace them. In some places, the ruts are a hand's breadth deep or more, testament to how many thousands of vehicles must have passed this way. On either side of the street, raised sidewalks provide pedestrian walkways. These sidewalks are higher than you might expect, raised almost 2 feet above the street level in most places. This wasn't for show. The Romans had no modern sewage systems or storm drains in the way we understand them. Instead, water and waste ran down the streets, especially during rain, and the raised sidewalks kept pedestrians' feet dry. The height also served another purpose, creating a clear separation between the pedestrian realm and the space where carts and animals moved, an early form of traffic management. At regular intervals, stepping stones cross the street, large blocks of stone elevated to the same height as the sidewalks, allowing pedestrians to cross from one side to the other without descending into the street. The spacing of these stones is precise, calculated to allow wheeled vehicles to pass between them while still providing convenient crossing points for people on foot. Walking across one of these stepping stones now, your feet treading the same path that Roman feet trod, you feel a direct physical connection to the past that no photograph or video could ever convey. Along the street, Shops and businesses open directly onto the sidewalk. Many of these are thermopolia, ancient fast food restaurants where hot food and drink were served to customers who stood at the counter. The design is instantly recognizable even after 2,000 years. An L-shaped counter faces the street, built of masonry and faced with marble or painted plaster. Set into the counter are large clay vessels called dolia, which held food and drink, probably kept warm by coals or hot water beneath. One particularly well-preserved thermopolium still shows traces of its painted decoration. The counter is painted with vivid frescoes showing food items, presumably advertising what was available for sale here. You can see fish and birds, vegetables and fruit, rendered in bright colors that haven't completely faded despite centuries of exposure. The paint is cracked and weathered, but you can still make out enough detail to recognize individual items. Behind the counter, there's a small room that would have served as the kitchen and storage area. The walls are blackened with smoke, and you can still see the built-in cooking hearth where food was prepared. On one wall, a fresco shows the guardian spirit of the shop, the genius loci, receiving offerings from the owner. This wasn't just decoration. These images served a real function in the Roman worldview, acknowledging and honoring the protective forces that ensured the business's success. The thermopolium is empty now, but standing here in the morning light, you can almost imagine it as it was. The street would have been busy, especially in the morning and early evening when workers stopped for a quick meal. The air would have been filled with the smell of cooking, the voices of vendors calling out their wares, customers chatting as they ate, the general noise and bustle of urban life. The shop owner would have stood behind this very counter, serving food and drink, taking money, joking with regular customers, conducting the ordinary business of an ordinary day that ended in extraordinary catastrophe. Moving along the street, you notice how varied the buildings are. Unlike modern cities with their standardized architecture and zoning laws, Pompeii is wonderfully heterogeneous. A grand house with an elaborate entrance sits next to a modest workshop. A bakery occupies space next to a wealthy merchant's dwelling. Shops, homes, workshops, taverns, all jumbled together in what seems at first like random disorder, but which actually reflects a sophisticated understanding of urban life. The bakeries are particularly fascinating to examine in detail. Pompeii had more than 30 bakeries, testifying to the importance of bread in the Roman diet. Walking into one of these establishments now, you can see the entire production process laid out before you. In the back room, large millstones made of volcanic rock still stand in place. These mills consisted of two parts: a conical lower stone that remained stationary and an hourglass-shaped upper stone that rotated around it. Grain was poured into the top, and as the upper stone turned, driven by human or animal power, it ground the grain between the two surfaces, producing flour that collected in a circular trough at the base. The mills are impressive pieces of engineering, precisely carved to create the grinding surfaces needed to process grain efficiently. They're also heavy, each one weighing hundreds of pounds, testament to the Romans' ability to work stone with remarkable precision. Standing next to one of these mills, running your hand over the smooth volcanic stone, you can almost hear the rumble of the grinding, the creak of the wooden frame, the shuffling of the donkey or slave who walked in circles all day turning the mill. Beyond the mills, the ovens where bread was baked still stand, their interiors blackened with the soot of countless fires. These ovens were dome-shaped structures built of brick and faced with heat-resistant tiles. They were heated by building fires inside them, and when the oven reached the right temperature, the coals would be raked out and loaves of bread placed directly on the hot oven floor. The residual heat from the masonry would bake the bread, creating the crusty, flavorful loaves that were a staple of the Roman diet. In one bakery, archaeologists found carbonized loaves of bread, perfectly preserved by the eruption. These loaves show the characteristic round shape and scored surface that allowed the bread to be broken into wedges for serving. The bread's interior structure is still visible, showing the air pockets created by fermentation and the texture created by the stone ground flour. These carbonized loaves provide direct evidence of what Pompeians ate, allowing us to understand their diet in concrete terms rather than through abstract historical accounts. The fulleries, or cloth processing workshops, offer another glimpse into Pompeian commercial life. These establishments cleaned and processed woolen cloth, treating raw wool or cleaning used garments through a series of chemical and mechanical processes. The work was unpleasant, involving harsh chemicals and physical labor, but it was essential to the city's economy and employed significant numbers of workers. Walking into the fullery of Stephanus, one of the best preserved examples, you can see the large vats where cloth was washed and treated. These vats are built into the floor, deep basins where workers would tread on the cloth in a mixture of water and various cleaning agents. The primary cleaning agent was a substance called fuller's earth, a type of clay that absorbed oils and dirt from fabric, but urine was also used because its ammonia content helped break down organic stains and grease. The smell must have been extraordinary, a combination of wet wool, chemicals, and human waste that would have made the fullery a decidedly unpleasant place to work or live near. Yet these workshops were scattered throughout the city, including in residential neighborhoods. Another example of the mixing of commercial and domestic spaces that characterized Roman urban planning. Near the fullery, you notice something else about Pompeian streets: the sophisticated water management system. At intervals along the sidewalks, there are small stone blocks with holes drilled through them. These were street drains designed to channel water from the sidewalks into the street and then into larger underground drains that carried wastewater away from inhabited areas. The system wasn't as elaborate as modern sewage systems, but it was effective enough to keep the city relatively clean and healthy. Public fountains were fed by the city's aqueduct system, which brought water from mountain springs many miles away. The aqueduct entered the city at its highest point and then distributed water through a network of lead pipes to fountains, baths, and wealthy houses that could afford private connections. The system was designed with remarkable sophistication, using gravity to maintain water pressure and incorporating settling tanks and filters to remove sediment and impurities. The Romans didn't segregate commercial and residential space the way modern cities often do. Instead, they understood that a healthy city needs diversity, needs the mixing of different functions and social classes, needs the vibrancy that comes from having different types of activity happening in close proximity. This mixing is evident everywhere you look. The ground floors of many grand houses contain shops that face the street, their owners renting out this prime commercial space while living in the private quarters behind and above. The wine shops are another common feature of Pompeian streets. These establishments sold wine by the cup or amphora, serving both a local clientele and travelers passing through. The wine was stored in large dolia, ceramic jars built into the shop's counter, each one capable of holding hundreds of liters. The wine wasn't the refined vintages we might imagine, but rough country wines, sometimes mixed with water, honey, or spices to improve the flavor or mask defects. One wine shop still shows its painted price list on the wall, advertising different wines at different prices. The cheapest wine, probably rough local production, costs just a single as, the smallest Roman coin. Better wine, perhaps imported from more prestigious regions, cost several times as much. The existence of this price list speaks to a literate customer base capable of reading the advertisements and a competitive market where proprietors needed to attract customers with visible pricing. As you walk the streets in the late morning light, you begin to notice the graffiti more systematically. It's everywhere, scratched or painted on walls throughout the city. Some of it is political. Endorsements of candidates for local office with slogans like "Vote for Marcus Holconius for Duumvir, he's a good man." Some of it is commercial, advertisements for gladiatorial games or announcements of property for rent. Some of it is profane or obscene, testifying to the same impulses that drive modern graffiti writers. But some of the graffiti is surprisingly poetic and touching. One inscription reads, "Nothing lasts forever. When the sun has shone brightly, it returns to the ocean. The moon wanes after having been full. So too the force of the winds calms into a gentle breeze." Another simply states, Pyrrhus to his colleague Chias, "I grieve because you have died, and I'll always grieve." These aren't the words of great poets or philosophers. They're the spontaneous expressions of ordinary people grappling with the eternal questions of change and loss and mortality. At one corner, a public fountain provides fresh water for the neighborhood. The fountain is simple in design, a masonry basin with a spout where water once flowed continuously from the city's aqueduct system. The stone is worn smooth around the spout, polished by the hands of countless people who filled their water jugs here over the centuries. Even now, in the soft morning light, you can see how the water has left mineral deposits on the stone, pale streaks and patches that mark the flow patterns. The aqueduct system that supplied these fountains was a marvel of Roman engineering. Water was brought from springs in the mountains many miles away, carried by a system of channels and pipes that maintained a gentle downward slope across the entire distance. In Pompeii itself, the water was distributed through lead pipes to public fountains, baths, and, in wealthier neighborhoods, directly into private homes. The system was so well designed that water flowed continuously, keeping the fountains always fresh and drinkable. Next to the fountain, graffiti covers the wall. Lots of graffiti. The Romans loved writing on walls, and Pompeii's walls are covered with thousands of inscriptions ranging from political slogans to love declarations to simple announcements of who was here and when. Some of this graffiti is crude, but some shows considerable wit and poetry. One inscription near this fountain reads, In Latin, I wonder, O wall, that you have not fallen in ruins from supporting the stupidities of so many scribblers. The irony of someone writing this complaint on the very wall they're criticizing seems to have been lost on the ancient scribbler. Reading these inscriptions, which range from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the political to the pornographic, you get a sense of Pompeii as a real city, full of real people with all their passions and pettiness, their hopes and frustrations, their loves and hatreds. History often gives us the grand narrative, the story of emperors and armies, of great events and momentous decisions. But these walls give us something else, the raw, unfiltered voices of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. Continuing down the Via dell'Abbondanza, you pass more shops and businesses. A Faunica, where woolen cloth was cleaned and processed, its large vat still visible in the workroom. A bakery, its grinding stones and ovens still in place, the oven's interior still blackened with the soot of the last fires that burned there. A wine shop, its storage jars sunk into the counter, their interior still stained by the wine they once held. Each of these businesses was someone's livelihood, someone's daily work, someone's investment and pride. The baker who woke before dawn to light his ovens, the fuller who labored in the pungent chemicals used to clean cloth, the wine merchant who calculated his profits and worried about his competition. All of them going about their business, dealing with the same concerns that merchants deal with today: profit and loss, customers and competitors, the daily grind of making a living. The street is wider here than it was near the Forum, and you can see how the urban fabric changes as you move away from the civic centre. Near the Forum, buildings are grander, more formally arranged, reflecting their public importance. Here, away from the centre, things are more casual, more organic. Buildings lean and shift, their walls not quite aligned with each other, creating odd angles and irregular spaces that speak to centuries of incremental growth and change. In some places, you can see where buildings have been modified over time, where doorways have been filled in or new ones cut through walls, where rooms have been added or subdivided, where the needs and preferences of successive owners have left their mark on the architecture. This palimpsest quality, this sense of layered history, makes the city feel more real somehow, more lived in. And if everything had been frozen in a single moment of pristine perfection. The sun is well up now, and its light is strong and warm on your shoulders. The shadows have shifted, becoming shorter and harder edged, and the soft golden light of early morning has given way to the clearer, more neutral illumination of mid-morning. You can hear voices more clearly now, the archaeological staff beginning their day, a few other early visitors exploring the site. Your solitary communion with the ancient city is ending, but you're grateful for the time you've had, these quiet hours when the stones seem to speak more clearly. But there's still more to see, and you turn off the main street into one of the residential areas, ready to explore the houses where Pompeii's people actually lived their private lives. Houses and private life. The House of the Faun is one of the largest and most luxurious residences in Pompeii, occupying an entire city block, and approaching its entrance from the street, you're struck immediately by the grandeur that's evident even in ruins. The doorway is wide and imposing, framed by pilasters that once supported an elaborate facade. On the threshold, in mosaic letters, the greeting "Have," which is Latin for welcome, invites you in, just as it invited guests 2,000 years ago. Stepping through the entrance, you enter the first atrium, and even though the roof is gone now and morning sky shows where elaborately painted ceiling beams once were, you can still sense the magnificence this space must have possessed. The atrium was the heart of a Roman house, the first truly interior space that guests would see, and wealthy homeowners spared no expense in making it impressive. In the center of the atrium floor, there's a marble pool called an impluvium, designed to collect rainwater that would have fallen through the compluvium, the rectangular opening in the roof directly above it. The impluvium is empty now, its stone dry and warmed by the sun, but you can imagine how it would have looked with water, how that pool of water in the center of the house would have reflected light onto the surrounding walls, creating a play of moving light and shadow that would have made the space feel alive and dynamic. Beyond the impluvium, on the far side of the atrium, there's a small bronze statue that gives the house its name. It's a replica, the original having been moved to the museum in Naples for preservation. But even this copy captures the grace and humor of the piece. It shows a faun, a half-human, half-goat creature from Roman mythology, dancing with his arms raised, his face expressing pure joy in movement. The statue is small, barely 2 feet high, but it has a presence that draws the eye and delights the heart. Around the atrium, doorways open into smaller rooms, cubicular, which served as bedrooms and private spaces. These rooms are small by modern standards, many barely large enough for a bed, and perhaps a small chest for storing clothes and personal items. But the Romans didn't spend their leisure time in bedrooms the way we often do. Bedrooms were for sleeping, nothing more. And so they were designed to be functional rather than spacious. Walking into one of these cubicula, you notice that the walls are painted with elaborate frescoes in what's known as the second style of Pompeian painting. This style, which was popular in the 1st century BCE, creates architectural illusions on flat walls, painting columns and doorways, and architectural details that make the walls seem to recede into imaginary spaces. The effect is remarkably sophisticated, using perspective and shading to create depth and dimension where none actually exists. The frescoes are faded now, their colors dulled by time and exposure, but in places where paint was protected from direct sunlight, you can still see traces of the original brilliance. Deep reds, bright yellows, vivid blues, emerald greens, all rendered in mineral-based pigments that were mixed with the wet plaster of the wall, binding them permanently into the surface. The technique called fresco, which means fresh in Italian, created paintings of remarkable durability. And it's because of this technique that we can still see these colors after 2,000 years. Leaving the cubicula, you walk through to the second atrium. Because this house is so large, it has 2 of them, each with its own impluvium and surrounding rooms. The second atrium is smaller and simpler than the first, probably serving more private family functions, while the first atrium was reserved for receiving guests and conducting business. Beyond the second atrium, you enter the peristyle, and this is where the true magnificence of the house reveals itself. The peristyle is a large rectangular garden surrounded by a colonnade, an interior courtyard that brings light and air into the heart of the house. The columns are tall and graceful, painted in bright colors that would have contrasted beautifully with the greenery of the garden plants. Now the paint has mostly faded, but you can still see traces of red and yellow, hints of the original vibrancy. The garden itself is planted now with some of the same species that would have grown here in antiquity, herbs and flowers and small trees that the excavators determined from analyzing the root cavities and organic remains found during excavation. Rosemary and laurel, myrtle and ivy, roses and lilies, all growing in carefully arranged beds that follow the ancient patterns. Walking through the peristyle garden in the morning light, with the scent of herbs and flowers in the air and the sound of birdsong overhead, you can imagine what this space would have meant to the people who lived here in the heat of a Mediterranean summer, when the sun beats down mercilessly and the stone buildings become ovens, this garden would have been an oasis, a cool, shaded space where breezes move through the colonnade and the sound of water from a fountain provided a soothing background to conversation and contemplation. On the far side of the peristyle, you come to what was probably the house's most magnificent room, the exedra, where the famous Alexander mosaic was found. The mosaic itself is gone, now displayed in the Archaeological Museum, but a reproduction has been placed here so visitors can see something of what it looked like in situ. The mosaic is enormous, measuring roughly 8.5 feet by 16 feet, and it depicts the Battle of Issus, where Alexander the Great defeated the Persian king Darius III. The artistry of the mosaic is breathtaking. It's composed of more than 1 million tiny pieces of colored stone, each one carefully cut and placed to create an image of astonishing detail and dynamism. You can see individual faces in the crowd of soldiers, the expressions of fear and determination, the movement of horses and the clash of weapons. The composition is masterful, focusing on the moment when Alexander, on the left, drives his cavalry charge toward Darius, who is shown in his chariot on the right, his hand reaching out in a gesture that could be either commanding his troops or acknowledging defeat. This mosaic wasn't just decoration. It was a statement of cultural values and political identification. By the time this mosaic was created, probably in the 2nd century BC, Alexander had been dead for more than 100 years, but he remained that ultimate symbol of Hellenistic culture and military excellence. The Roman owners of this house, by displaying this scene, were aligning themselves with that cultural tradition, claiming a connection to the sophistication and glory of the Greek world. Leaving the house of the Faun, you walk through the streets toward another famous residence, the house of the Vettii. This house belonged to 2 freedmen, former slaves who had achieved wealth and success in business, and their home is a testament to social mobility in the Roman world. The house is smaller than the house of the Faun, but it's no less magnificently decorated, perhaps even more so in some ways, as if the owners were compensating for their lower social status with the lavishness of their display. The entrance to the house of the Vettii is guarded by one of Pompeii's most famous frescoes, a depiction of Priapus, the god of fertility, shown in an extremely explicit manner that often surprises modern visitors. The image served an apotropaic function, meaning it was believed to ward off evil and protect the house from misfortune. The Romans had a very different attitude towards such imagery than modern Western culture, seeing nothing shameful or inappropriate in such direct representation of sexuality and fertility. Inside the house, the atrium is relatively modest, but beyond it, the peristyle garden is magnificent. The garden is surrounded by a colonnade painted in vivid colors, and the columns themselves bear decorative friezes showing cupids engaged in various activities: goldsmithing and perfume making, flower selling and winemaking, all rendered with delicate precision and remarkable detail. The main reception room, the triclinium or dining room, contains some of the finest frescoes in Pompeii. The walls are divided into panels showing mythological scenes painted in the Fourth style, which was popular in the decades just before the eruption. One panel shows the infant Hercules strangling serpents, demonstrating his divine strength even in infancy. Another shows Ariadne abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos, her pose expressing despair and bewilderment. Each scene is beautifully composed, the figures rendered with anatomical precision and emotional sensitivity. The colors in this room are astonishing. Despite being buried for nearly 2,000 years, despite being exposed to moisture and chemicals and all the forces of decay, the reds and yellows and blues and greens still glow with an intensity that seems almost impossible. The red in particular, a shade called Pompeian red that became famous because of these very walls, has a depth and richness that modern paints struggle to match. Standing in this room, looking at these frescoes in the gentle morning light that streams through the open doorway, you're confronted with the sheer humanity of the people who lived here. These weren't primitive ancestors stumbling their way towards civilization. These were sophisticated people with refined aesthetic sensibilities, people who understood color and composition, narrative and emotion, people who invested significant resources in creating beautiful living spaces, not because they needed to, but because beauty mattered to them. You visit several more houses, each one offering its own insights into ancient life. The Villa of the Mysteries, on the outskirts of the city, contains the famous fresco cycle, showing what appears to be the initiation rites of the cult of Dionysus. Life-sized figures engaged in mysterious ceremonies that have fascinated and puzzled scholars for decades. The house of the tragic poet, famous for its cave canam, beware of dog. Mosaic at the entrance, showing a chained dog rendered with such naturalism that you can almost hear it barking. The house of Julia Felix, whose owner converted part of her residence into rental apartments and public baths after the earthquake of 62 AD. an early example of adapting to changed economic circumstances. In each house, you see the same basic pattern: the atrium for receiving guests and conducting business, the peristyle for private family life, the careful attention to decoration and display, the integration of art and daily life in a way that modern Western culture has largely lost. But you also see individual variation, each house reflecting the tastes and resources of its owners, each one a unique expression of ancient personality. The houses also reveal the social structure of Roman life in intimate detail. In the grander houses, you can identify the different spaces assigned to different social ranks. The atrium and formal reception rooms were for business and entertaining social equals. The peristyle and family rooms were more private and tucked away in the back corners, often accessible only through narrow passages. You find the servants' quarters, small cramped rooms with minimal decoration, spaces that reflect the harsh reality of life for those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. In the house of the Vettii, for instance, next to the elegant public rooms with their magnificent frescoes, there's a series of small chambers that were clearly occupied by slaves. These rooms are plain, their walls unpainted or painted in simple patterns, their floors of beaten earth rather than mosaic. The contrast is stark and unsettling, a reminder that the beauty and luxury enjoyed by some was built on the labor of others who lived in very different conditions just a few steps away. The kitchen of a wealthy Pompeian house reveals another layer of ancient life. These weren't the gleaming stainless steel kitchens of modern times, but working spaces designed for efficiency and function. The hearth dominates one wall, a masonry structure built to contain cooking fires while channeling smoke out through vents in the roof. Around the hearth, niches and shelves hold cooking vessels, amphoras for storing ingredients, and the various tools needed for food preparation. The walls are blackened with soot, evidence of thousands of meals prepared over the years the house was occupied. In the house of Julia Felix, you discover another aspect of Pompeian domestic life. This house is particularly interesting because it shows adaptation to changing circumstances. After the earthquake of 62 AD damaged much of the city and presumably affected the economic fortunes of many residents, Julia Felix converted portions of her large house into rental properties. Part of the house became apartments that could be leased to tenants, while another section was converted into public baths that charged admission. This entrepreneurial adaptation speaks to a practical, business-minded approach to property ownership. Rather than simply maintaining a grand residence that had become economically burdensome, Julia Felix reimagined her property as an income-generating asset. The apartments she created were comfortable but modest, each one consisting of a few rooms opening onto a shared courtyard. The public baths were beautifully decorated and well equipped, offering services that would attract paying customers from the neighborhood and beyond. Walking through Julia Felix's property, you can trace the boundaries between her private residence and the commercial portions, seeing how walls were built or doorways blocked to create separate spaces with separate access. You can see the painted advertisements on the exterior walls, announcing the availability of apartments and baths, offering these amenities to potential tenants and customers. And you can see in the quality of the work that this wasn't a desperate last-minute conversion, but a carefully planned business venture undertaken by someone who understood both architecture and economics. The House of the Menander offers yet another perspective on wealthy Pompeian life. Named for a fresco depicting the Greek playwright Menander, this house is one of the most extensively excavated and studied in Pompeii. It belonged to the Pompeii family, who were among the city's leading citizens, and it shows the full range of amenities that a truly wealthy family could command. The house includes not just the standard atrium and peristyle, but also private baths for the family's use, elaborate gardens with fountains and sculptures, servants' quarters that could house a substantial domestic staff, and even rooms that appear to have been dedicated to the storage and display of family archives and heirlooms. In one room, archaeologists found a collection of silver tableware so extensive and valuable that it suggests the family either entertained on a grand scale or had accumulated wealth over multiple generations. The servant quarters in the House of the Menander are particularly revealing. They're located in a separate wing of the house, accessible through service passages that allowed slaves to move through the property without passing through the main family spaces. These quarters include small sleeping chambers, workrooms, and a kitchen separate from the main kitchen, suggesting a complex household organization with different staff assigned to different functions. But perhaps the most poignant discovery in the houses is the evidence of ordinary daily life, the small details that bring the ancient inhabitants to life as real people. In one kitchen, amphora jars still stand where they were left, some still containing the residue of oil or wine or garum, the fermented fish sauce that was a staple of Roman cooking. In a bedroom, a wooden cradle was found, its wood carbonized by the eruption's heat, but still recognizable, still capable of evoking the image of a baby who slept there and whose fate remains unknown. In the house of the tragic poet, despite its relatively modest size, you find evidence of sophisticated literary culture. The house takes its name from a mosaic showing a theatrical scene with actors in dramatic poses, and throughout the residence there are references to Greek drama and literature. One room contains a fresco depicting the Judgment of Paris, the mythological event that set in motion the Trojan War, rendered with careful attention to the story's details and emotional content. This literary sophistication wasn't limited to the wealthy elite. Even relatively modest houses often display mythological scenes and literary references, suggesting that education and cultural refinement were valued across a broad spectrum of Pompeian society. The ability to recognize and appreciate these references, to understand the stories being depicted and their moral or philosophical implications, seems to have been considered an important mark of civilized living. In a garden, excavators found the imprint of a root system and were able to determine what kind of tree had grown there and replanted it in the same spot. So now, 2,000 years later, the same species grows in the same earth, its branches spreading where ancient branches spread, its shade falling where ancient shade fell. These continuities, these echoes across time, are what make Pompeii so powerful, so moving. The morning is advancing, and the site is no longer empty. You can hear the voices of tour groups beginning to arrive, the multilingual chatter of guides explaining the significance of what visitors are seeing. But you've had your private time with the houses, your quiet moments to absorb what they can teach, and you're grateful for it. Now you turn your attention to the art and decoration that makes these houses so magnificent, to the frescoes and mosaics that transform bare walls and floors into canvases for myth and beauty and daily life. Art and decoration. The art of Pompeii is one of its greatest treasures, and seeing it here, in the context for which it was created, gives you an understanding of Roman aesthetics and values that no museum display could ever match. The frescoes that cover the walls and the mosaics that pave the floors weren't created to be viewed in isolation, carefully lit and labeled behind glass. They were created to be lived with, to be part of the daily experience of the people who occupied these spaces. In the house of the Vettii, you spend time examining the frieze of cupids in the peristyle, and the detail is extraordinary. Each tiny cupid is engaged in a specific task, rendered with such precision that you can identify not just the activity, but the tools and materials being used. Here, a cupid operates a goldsmith's hammer, the tiny figure bent over an anvil, the hammer raised in mid-stroke. There, another cupid stirs a large vat, presumably mixing perfume or unguents, while a companion fans the flames beneath it. Each scene is a miniature narrative, a glimpse into the commercial life of Pompeii. The colors in the frieze are remarkably well preserved, and you can see the full range of pigments available to Roman painters. The reds come from cinnabar or red ochre, mineral-based pigments that have proven remarkably stable over time. The yellows and oranges are ochres as well, iron-based compounds that occur naturally and were mined extensively in the Roman world. The blues are more precious, made from Egyptian blue, one of the first synthetic pigments ever created, manufactured by heating a mixture of sand, copper, and natron to create a vivid, stable color. The greens are more problematic. Some Roman greens were made from copper-based compounds that have oxidized over time, changing color or fading entirely. In some frescoes, what were once green garments or backgrounds have turned to gray or black, altering the original color scheme in ways we can only partially reconstruct. But in protected areas, in corners and niches where direct light didn't penetrate, the greens still glow with their original intensity. The technique of fresco painting, where pigments are applied to wet plaster, creates a bond between color and wall that's remarkably durable. As the plaster dries and carbonates, converting from calcium hydroxide to calcium carbonate, it locks the pigments into the surface, creating something that's neither quite paint nor quite stone, but something in between. The result is a painted surface that can last for millennia if protected from the worst effects of weathering. The process of creating a fresco was complex and required significant skill and planning. The wall would first be prepared with several layers of plaster, each one allowed to dry before the next was applied. The final layer, called the intonaco, would be applied in sections small enough to be painted while the plaster remained wet, usually an area that could be completed in a day. This meant that large frescoes had to be carefully planned so that the joins between sections would be invisible or would fall along natural divisions in the composition. Once the wet plaster was applied, the painter would work quickly, applying pigments that would sink into and bond with the plaster as it dried. Mistakes were difficult to correct. If an error was made, the plaster had to be removed and reapplied, an expensive and time-consuming process. This meant that fresco painters had to be highly skilled, capable of working quickly and accurately without the luxury of extensive revision. Some details could be added after the plaster dried, painted on top of the finished fresco, using techniques similar to tempera painting. These details, called secco work, weren't as durable as true fresco and have often been lost over time, but they allowed painters to add fine details and highlights that would have been difficult to achieve while racing against the drying plaster. The symbolism in Pompeian art is rich and multi-layered, drawing on mythology, literature, and cultural values that would have been widely understood by educated Romans. A fresco showing Hercules might seem to modernize like simple decoration, but to a Roman viewer, it would have carried multiple meanings. Hercules was a symbol of strength and virtue, of the triumph of civilization over barbarism. His 12 labors represented the struggles that every person faces in life, and his eventual deification suggested that human effort could achieve divine rewards. Similarly, a fresco showing Venus might be appreciated for its aesthetic beauty, but it would also carry associations with love, fertility, and divine protection. Venus was the patron goddess of Pompeii, believed to watch over and protect the city, and her image in a house would serve both decorative and devotional functions. The goddess wasn't just a subject for art. She was a real presence in the lives of Pompeians, someone to whom prayers were addressed and from whom favor was sought. The garden paintings reveal particular sophistication in their understanding of perspective and spatial illusion. These weren't naive attempts to depict three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. They were conscious artistic choices using techniques of atmospheric perspective for shortening and careful placement of elements to create convincing illusions of depth. The painters understood that distant objects appear smaller and less detailed, that colors become cooler and less saturated with distance, that overlapping elements create depth relationships that the eye reads as spatial recession. In one garden painting, you can see all these techniques employed masterfully. The foreground shows flowers and low plants, rendered in sharp detail with bright, saturated colors. The middle ground shows bushes and small trees, their details less precise, their colors slightly muted. The background shows tall trees and distant architecture rendered in soft blues and greys that suggest great distance. Birds and butterflies are placed at various depths, their sizes and detail levels carefully calibrated to reinforce the spatial illusion. The overall effect is remarkably convincing, creating a window into an imaginary garden that seems to extend indefinitely beyond the painted wall. Moving through different houses, you notice how painting styles evolved over time. Pompeii's frescoes are classified into 4 styles, a system developed by archaeologists to understand the chronological development of Roman wall painting. The first style, popular in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, imitated expensive marble panels through paint, creating the illusion of luxury at lower cost. The second style, dominant in the 1st century BC, created architectural illusions, painting false doorways and windows and colonnades that seem to extend the actual space of the room. The third style, which flourished in the Augustan period, moved away from illusion toward more decorative approaches, dividing walls into panels with delicate ornamental frames and centering each panel on a small vignette or mythological scene. The fourth style, popular in the decades before the eruption, was more eclectic, combining elements of the earlier styles into complex compositions that could include architectural elements, mythological panels, and purely decorative motifs all on the same wall. In the House of the Golden Bracelet, you find an exquisite example of garden painting, a style that became popular in the 1st century AD. One wall of a bedroom is painted to show a garden scene, with trees and flowers and birds rendered in remarkable detail against a dark blue background. The painting creates the illusion that the room opens directly onto a garden, extending the limited interior space into an imaginary outdoor realm. The botanical detail in the painting is precise enough that experts have been able to identify many of the plant species depicted. There are roses and lilies, myrtle and ivy, oleander and laurel, all plants that would have grown in Pompeian gardens and that the artist clearly knew well. Birds perch among the branches, including species that can be identified as European robins and blackbirds, common in the Campanian landscape. One bird has been identified as a paradise flycatcher, a migrant species that would have passed through the region in spring and autumn, suggesting that the painter was working from direct observation of the natural world. The garden paintings serve a practical as well as aesthetic function. Pompeian houses, while often large, didn't always have extensive outdoor space. The urban density of the city meant that many houses had limited or no gardens. By painting garden scenes on interior walls, homeowners could bring the refreshment and beauty of nature into spaces that would otherwise feel enclosed and claustrophobic. It was a clever solution to a real problem, and one that reveals how important the natural world was to Roman aesthetic sensibility. The mosaics of Pompeii are no less impressive than the frescoes, though they're often less well preserved, simply because they're underfoot, subject to wear from countless footsteps, both ancient and modern. But where they survive intact, they're breathtaking in their artistry and execution. The Alexander mosaic in the House of the Faun is the most famous, but it's far from the only masterpiece. In the House of the Tragic Poet, the Cave Canon mosaic shows a chained dog with such lifelike detail that you can see individual links in the chain and individual hairs in the dog's coat. The dog's posture is aggressive, its teeth bared in a snarl, and you can almost hear the warning bark. It's a practical piece, a warning to potential intruders, but it's also art of the highest quality, demonstrating that beauty and function weren't separate categories in the Roman mind. In the House of the Faun, another mosaic shows a Nile scene with pygmies hunting hippopotami among papyrus plants and crocodiles. The scene is simultaneously exotic and humorous, depicting the peoples and animals of Egypt with a mixture of fascination and caricature that reveals Roman attitudes toward the wider world. Egypt was part of the Roman Empire by this time, conquered by Augustus, but it still held a certain mystique, a quality of otherness that made it an appealing subject for decorative art. Many floor mosaics are geometric rather than figurative, displaying complex patterns of interlocking shapes and colors that create optical effects and visual interest without depicting recognizable subjects. These geometric mosaics are no less sophisticated than the figurative ones, demonstrating a mastery of mathematics and design that's truly impressive. Some patterns create the illusion of three-dimensionality, with cubes appearing to project from or recede into the floor. Others use color gradations to create effects of movement or depth. The materials used in mosaics varied with the wealth of the homeowner and the importance of the space being decorated. The finest mosaics use small tesserae, sometimes as small as a few millimeters across, cut from colored stone or glass. These micro-mosaics, as they're sometimes called, allowed for extremely fine detail and subtle color gradations, approaching the resolution of painting. More utilitarian mosaics used larger tesserae and simpler color schemes, often just black and white, creating bold graphic patterns that were visually effective without requiring the same investment of time and materials. Walking through the houses, examining the art in the morning light, you're struck by how different this is from experiencing it in a museum. In a museum, each piece is isolated, spotlit, explained by a label that gives you the what and the when, but can't really convey the how or the why. Here, the art exists in relationship to the spaces it decorates, and you can understand how it functioned in the lives of the people who lived with it. A bedroom fresco showing a mythological scene wasn't meant to be studied from 2 feet away by scholars taking notes. It was meant to be glimpsed as you pass through the room, perhaps by lamplight in the evening, its colors and composition creating a mood, evoking a story, enriching the daily experience of moving through domestic space. The garden paintings weren't meant to fool anyone into thinking they were looking at real gardens. They were meant to evoke the pleasure of gardens, to bring something of the outside world into interior spaces, to refresh the mind and eye. The art of Pompeii also reveals the cultural world that shaped it. The overwhelming majority of the figurative art draws on Greek mythology and literature, reflecting the high status that Greek culture held in the Roman imagination. Scenes from the Trojan War, from the adventures of Hercules, from the stories of the gods and heroes, all these appear again and again in different houses, rendered by different artists, but drawing on a common cultural vocabulary that educated Romans would have recognized and appreciated. But there's also Roman content, including political propaganda and local history. In some houses, you find portraits that appear to be of the homeowners themselves, depicted in the style of official imperial portraiture. In others, there are scenes that seem to reference local events or personages, though without written context. These are often difficult to interpret with certainty. And then there's the erotic art, which has shocked and fascinated visitors since the excavations began. The Romans had a very different attitude toward sexual imagery than most modern Western cultures, seeing nothing shameful or inappropriate in the direct depiction of sexual acts. Such imagery appears in various contexts, from the protective phallic symbols at entrances to more explicit scenes in private rooms. Some of this art is found in brothels, where it may have served as advertising or menu of services, but much of it appears in ordinary houses, suggesting that it served other functions as well, perhaps apotropic protection, perhaps simply as erotic stimulation. The art of Pompeii is overwhelming in its abundance and variety, and you could spend weeks examining it all and still not see everything. But what strikes you most, walking through these houses in the growing morning light, is how this art reveals a culture that valued beauty, that saw the creation and appreciation of art not as an optional luxury, but as an essential part of civilized life. These weren't museum pieces to be reverently viewed from a distance. This was art that people lived with daily, that shaped their experience of their own homes, that brought mythology and nature and beauty into the ordinary spaces of daily life. The amphitheater and public entertainment. Walking toward the eastern edge of the city, you approach the amphitheater, and even from a distance, you can see its massive oval form rising above the surrounding buildings. The Amphitheater of Pompeii, completed around 70 BC, is one of the oldest surviving permanent amphitheaters in the Roman world, and it's remarkably well preserved, giving you a clear sense of what it must have been like to attend the spectacles held here. Approaching the entrance, you notice something immediately. Unlike many later amphitheaters, this one doesn't stand free. Instead, it's partially dug into the ground, using the excavated earth to form the banks of seating. This was a clever solution to a structural problem. Building a freestanding amphitheater required massive walls and complex vaulting to support the weight of the seating tiers. By digging down and using the earth itself as part of the structure, the builders could create the same seating capacity with less expensive construction. The exterior walls that do stand above ground are relatively plain, built of rough stone and brick, without the elaborate facade that characterizes later amphitheaters like the Colosseum in Rome. But there's a simple grandeur to this plainness, a functional honesty that suits the building's purpose. You enter through one of the ground-level passages that lead directly into the arena. These passages were used by the gladiators themselves, allowing them to enter from the street without passing through the spectator areas. Walking through one of these passages now, you're following the same path that countless gladiators followed, and it's impossible not to feel the weight of that history, the knowledge that men walked this way to what was, for many of them, their deaths. Emerging from the passage into the arena proper, you stop and simply look around. The arena is an ellipse roughly 100 meters long and 65 meters wide at its widest point. The floor is sand-covered now, as it would have been in antiquity, though the ancient sand is long gone, replaced by archaeologists to give visitors a sense of how the space originally looked. The Latin word for sand is arena, and this is where we get the modern English word for any space where contests take place. Around the arena, rising in tiers, are the seats for spectators. The seating is divided into 3 sections, reflecting the strict social hierarchy of Roman society. The Imma Cavea, the lowest section closest to the arena, was reserved for the elite, the city's magistrates and wealthy citizens who could afford the best seats. The Media Cavea, the middle section, was for ordinary citizens of middling status, and the Summa Cavea, the highest and most distant section, was for women and slaves, those at the bottom of the social hierarchy who were still permitted to attend, but only from the cheapest, most distant seats. The seating capacity is estimated at around 20,000 people, which is remarkable considering that Pompeii's population was probably only around 15,000. This wasn't just a local facility. The amphitheater drew spectators from surrounding towns and countryside, and on major festival days, the population of the city would swell dramatically as people poured in to see the games. Walking up through the seating tiers, climbing the ancient steps worn smooth by countless feet, you reach the upper level and sit on one of the stone seats. Even now, 2,000 years later, the acoustics are excellent. A person speaking at normal volume in the center of the arena can be heard clearly up here. This wasn't accidental. The Romans understood acoustic principles and designed their public buildings to allow sound to carry efficiently. Sitting here in the morning quiet, with the sun now high enough to illuminate the entire interior, you try to imagine what it would have been like on a day of games. The stands packed with people, 20,000 of them crowded together, the noise of their conversations creating a dull roar, the smell of sweat and food and the various perfumes and oils that Romans used. The anticipation building as the games were about to begin. Then the gladiators would enter, probably through those same ground-level passages you used. They would parade around the arena, their armor gleaming in the sunlight, their weapons held high. The crowd would roar its approval or derision, recognizing favorites or despising unpopular fighters. Bets would be placed. Arguments would break out. The whole massive crowd, would be focused on the sandy arena floor where men were about to fight and quite possibly die for their entertainment. The gladiatorial contests weren't simply random violence. They followed strict rules and traditions, with different types of gladiators fighting in prescribed ways with specified weapons and armor. A murmillo, heavily armored with a large shield and sword, might fight a retiarius, lightly armored but armed with a net and trident. A Thracian with curved sword and small shield might face a hoplomachus with spear and round shield. Each combination created different tactical situations, different visual spectacles for the crowd to appreciate. The games weren't always fatal. Gladiators were expensive to train and maintain, and their owners didn't want them killed unnecessarily. Many contests ended with one fighter clearly defeated but still alive, and the fate of the defeated man would be decided by the editor, the person sponsoring the games, often in consultation with the crowd. The famous thumbs up or thumbs down gesture, though its exact form is debated by scholars, signaled life or death for the defeated gladiator. But deaths certainly occurred, and when they did, the bodies were dragged from the arena through a narrow gate on the north side, a passage just wide enough for a corpse and the attendants carrying it. Sitting here now, looking at that gate, you feel a chill despite the warmth of the sun. That small opening represents the final exit for how many men? How many brave fighters? How many terrified prisoners condemned to death in the arena pass through that gate for the last time? The Amphitheater at Pompeii is also famous for an event that didn't involve gladiators at all, or at least not in the usual way. In the year 59 AD, a riot broke out during games between spectators from Pompeii and supporters from the neighboring town of Nuceria. The violence was so severe that it spilled out of the amphitheater into the surrounding streets, resulting in numerous deaths and injuries. The Roman Senate was so disturbed by this that they banned gladiatorial games in Pompeii for 10 years. A fresco found in a Pompeian house depicts this riot, showing the amphitheater surrounded by fighting crowds, with bodies lying in the streets. The painting is crude by the standards of Pompeian art, but it's vivid and dramatic, clearly showing the violence of the event. The riot speaks to the passionate attachments that Romans had to their entertainment, the way that what happened in the arena mattered deeply to spectators, generating emotions powerful enough to turn to violence. The ban on games was eventually lifted after only 3 years, following the earthquake of 62 AD, the earthquake had damaged the amphitheater, and repairs were undertaken using funds provided by wealthy citizens. One of these benefactors, Caius Cuspius Pansa, and his son, had their statues placed in niches flanking one of the entrances, ensuring that their generosity would be remembered by all who came to the games. Walking around the upper level of the amphitheater, you notice the strategic placement of staircases and passages that allowed large crowds to enter and exit efficiently. This was important for crowd control and safety. The Romans had experience with the dangers of large gatherings, and they designed their public buildings with this in mind, creating multiple access points and clear circulation patterns that prevented bottlenecks and crushing. Near the amphitheater, connected to it by a colonnade, is the large palaestra, an exercise ground where young men would train and compete in athletic events. The palaestra is a huge open space surrounded by colonnades with a swimming pool in the center. The pool is impressive, large enough for swimming and water sports, and seeing it now, you can imagine it filled with water, with young men diving and swimming and splashing in the Mediterranean sun. The palaestra served an important social function, providing a space for physical training and competition that the Romans believed was essential for developing civic virtue and military readiness. Young men would come here daily to exercise, to practice wrestling and boxing, to train with weapons, to develop the strength and skills that would serve them if they ever had to fight in Rome's armies. Standing in the palaestra, looking back toward the amphitheater with Mount Vesuvius rising in the background, you're struck by the completeness of Pompeii's civic life. The city had everything a Roman community needed: the commercial facilities, the religious spaces, the civic buildings, the entertainment venues, the training grounds. It was a fully functioning city, self-contained and self-sufficient, capable of providing its citizens with all the amenities that Roman civilization had to offer. The morning is advancing, the sun climbing higher, and the air is warming considerably now. You can feel the heat beginning to build, that characteristic Mediterranean warmth that will make midday uncomfortable, but is still pleasant at this hour. A few tourists have made their way to the amphitheater now, small groups wandering through the seating areas, taking photographs, listening to guides. But the space is large enough that it still feels empty, still capable of absorbing visitors without becoming crowded. You walk back down to the arena floor one more time, standing in the center, turning slowly in a circle to look up at all the seating tiers around you, even empty, even silent. The space has power. You can almost hear the ghostly echoes of 20,000 voices raised in excitement. Almost feel the tension of a gladiatorial combat. Almost sense the presence of all those Romans who sat in these very seats and cheered and gasped and argued about what they were seeing. But there's one more major aspect of Pompeian life to explore, and you leave the amphitheater and walk back toward the center of the city, toward the baths where Romans gathered daily, not just to wash, but to socialize and relax. Baths and social life. The Forum Baths stand just north of the Forum, and approaching them, you're struck by how prominent they are, how centrally located. This placement wasn't accidental. Bathing was central to Roman life, not just for hygiene, but for social interaction. And the baths were designed to be easily accessible to as many people as possible. Roman bathing followed a specific sequence of rooms, moving from cold to warm to hot and back again. The Forum baths, like most Roman bath complexes, are divided into separate sections for men and women, each section containing the full sequence of bathing rooms, but with different entrances and completely separate facilities. You enter through what would have been the men's entrance, stepping into a small vestibule and then into the Amphitheater, the changing room. The walls of this room still show the niches where bathers would have left their clothes and belongings while bathing. Above the niches, the ceiling is vaulted and decorated with stucco reliefs, though much of this decoration has been damaged by time and the eruptions effects. Light comes from a window high in one wall, and even now, with the roof partially collapsed, you can see how the room would have been illuminated, how the light would have fallen on the white stucco walls and the terracotta tiled floor. There would have been attendants here, slaves who would guard the bathers' belongings and assist them with undressing and dressing, performing the small services that made the bathing experience comfortable and convenient. From the changing room, you move into the frigidarium, the cold room. This is a small, round space with a cold water pool in the center. The pool is deep enough to immerse yourself, but not large enough for swimming. The water would have been cold, fed by aqueduct water that was kept unheated, providing a shock of cold that was believed to be healthful and invigorating. The walls of the frigidarium are painted with niches and architectural details that create the illusion of depth and complexity in what is actually a simple circular room. The ceiling is domed, and looking up, you can see how the dome is constructed, the careful arrangement of bricks and mortar that creates a curved surface strong enough to support its own weight without additional support. Next is the tepidarium, the warm room, a transitional space between the cold frigidarium and the hot caldarium. The tepidarium was heated to a moderate temperature, warm enough to be comfortable, but not as hot as the caldarium. Bathers would spend time here allowing their bodies to adjust to the heat before moving into the hottest room. The tepidarium still shows remnants of its heating system. The floor is raised on small brick pillars, creating a hollow space underneath through which hot air from a furnace could circulate. This system, called a hypercaust, heated the floor from below, and the floor tiles would become warm to hot depending on how close you stood to the furnace. The walls also have hollow chambers through which hot air could rise, warming the entire room with remarkable efficiency. The decoration in the tepidarium is more elaborate than in the other rooms. The walls are divided into panels showing athletes in various poses, their bodies rendered with the same attention to musculature and form that characterizes Roman athletic sculpture. The ceiling is barrel vaulted and decorated with stucco reliefs showing mythological scenes, though many of these have been damaged or lost. Finally, you enter the caldarium, the hot room, and even now, 2,000 years after the furnaces last burned, you can sense what this space must have been like. It's the largest of the bathing rooms, designed to accommodate many bathers at once. At one end is a large heated pool, the Alveus, where bathers could recline in hot water, relaxing tired muscles and opening pores. The heat in the caldarium would have been intense, approaching sauna-like conditions. The hot water combined with the underfloor heating would have created a steamy, humid atmosphere that would have been both physically and psychologically relaxing. Bathers would sit or recline in the hot water, perspiring heavily, conversing with friends, or simply enjoying the sensation of heat and relaxation. At the opposite end of the room from the hot pool is a labrum, a large basin filled with cold water. This provided a quick cold rinse to close the pores after the hot bath, a shock of cold that was considered healthful and refreshing. The labrum still stands in its original position, a large marble basin supported on a pedestal, positioned so that bathers could easily splash themselves with the cold water. Walking through the women's baths, you see a similar sequence of rooms, but on a smaller scale. The women's section was fully functional, but less elaborate, reflecting the lower social status of women in Roman society. The decorations, are simpler, the rooms smaller, but the basic amenities are all there, allowing women to endure same bathing experience as men, just in a separate and somewhat less luxurious context. The baths weren't just about washing. They were social centers where people gathered to meet friends, to discuss business, to gossip and flirt and argue. The larger bath complexes, like the Stabian baths in another part of the city, included exercise areas, gardens, shops, and rooms for massage and other treatments. Going to the baths was a daily ritual for many Romans, a central part of the rhythm of life. The Stabian baths, which you visit next, are older and larger than the Forum baths, and they show clear evidence of the earthquake damage that was still being repaired when Vesuvius erupted. One entire wing of the complex shows unfinished repair work, with new plaster applied to some walls but not others, with new pipes installed but not yet connected, with building materials still lying where workers left them on that October day in 79 AD. The bathing sequence in the Stabian baths is similar to the Forum baths, but the complex includes additional facilities. There's a large palestra, an exercise ground where bathers could work out before bathing. There are shops along the street frontage, rented out to merchants, providing income for the complex and convenience for bathers who might want to purchase oil or strigils or other bathing necessities. Most impressively, the Stabian baths include a swimming pool, a natatio, that's larger than anything in the Forum baths. The pool is rectangular, surrounded by columns that would have provided shade, with steps at one end allowing easy entry into the water. Standing beside this pool now, dry and empty, you can easily imagine it filled with water, with bathers swimming laps or simply cooling off on a hot summer day. The economics of the baths were complex and fascinating. Some baths were public facilities maintained by the city, while others were private businesses operated for profit. Entrance fees were low, deliberately kept affordable, so that even relatively poor citizens could attend regularly. The fees might be a quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, or sometimes free on certain days, or for certain categories of people like children or military veterans. The low entrance fees meant that baths had to generate income in other ways. The shops and rentals helped. So did charges for special services like massage or the use of exercise facilities. And baths could be spectacular advertisements for wealthy benefactors who might sponsor free bath days or pay for improvements and expansions. Their generosity recorded in inscriptions that ensured their names would be remembered with gratitude. Standing in the baths in the late morning light, you reflect on what these spaces meant to the people who used them. For wealthy Romans who had private baths in their own homes, the public baths weren't strictly necessary for hygiene, but they came anyway for the social experience, for the opportunity to see and be seen, to maintain and develop the social networks that were so important in Roman life. For poorer Romans who lived in small apartments without running water or private bathing facilities, the public baths were essential, providing access to cleanliness and comfort that would otherwise have been unavailable. The democratic nature of the baths, the fact that all free citizens could attend regardless of wealth, was an important aspect of Roman civic culture, creating spaces where social hierarchy was temporarily relaxed and rich and poor could mingle. The morning is now well advanced, the sun high in the sky, and the heat is becoming significant. The stone walls and paving that were cool when you arrived are now warm to the touch, and you can feel sweat beginning to prickle on your skin. It's time to turn your thoughts to the event that ended all this, the eruption that buried Pompeii and preserved it for us to discover. The tragic day, October 79 AD. For most of Pompeii's history, life proceeded with the usual mixture of routine and variation, the daily rounds of work and worship, commerce and entertainment, love and loss that characterize any human community. But in the year 79 AD, that changed. The date traditionally given for the eruption has long been August 24th, based on a letter written by Pliny the Younger describing the event. However, recent archaeological evidence, including a charcoal inscription found in 2018, reading the 16th day before the calends of November, suggests the eruption actually occurred on October 24th. The exact date matters less than what happened, and what happened was cataclysmic. For several days before the main eruption, the earth shook with small earthquakes, tremors that were common enough in this volcanically active region that many Pompeians didn't recognize them as warnings of what was coming. The people had lived through a major earthquake in 62 AD, and the city was still undergoing repairs and rebuilding from that event. Small tremors were just part of life here. Then, around 1 in the afternoon on that October day, Vesuvius exploded. The volcanic plug that had sealed the mountain's vent for centuries blew out with unimaginable force, and a column of gas ash and volcanic debris shot 20 miles into the sky, rising so high that it punched through the lower atmosphere into the stratosphere. From Pompeii, less than 6 miles from the crater, the sight would have been terrifying. The mountain that had been a familiar backdrop to daily life, its slopes covered with vineyards and orchards, suddenly transformed into a nightmare. The column rising from its summit would have blocked out the sun, turning day into darkness, and within minutes, ash and pumice began falling on the city. For the first 12 hours, this ashfall continued, burying Pompeii under a layer that would eventually reach more than 2 meters deep. The initial ashfall was of fine ash and small pumice stones, relatively light material that accumulated quickly but wasn't immediately deadly. Many Pompeians fled at this point, grabbing what valuables they could carry and heading out of the city toward the countryside, toward anywhere that wasn't under the shadow of that terrible column. But many stayed. Some were trying to protect their property, believing they could ride out the eruption. Some were probably trapped in collapsed buildings, their roofs having buckled under the weight of accumulating ash. Some were caring for family members who couldn't travel, and some probably just couldn't believe that things could get worse, couldn't imagine that the mountain that had been so benign for so long would actually kill them. Around midnight, the eruption's character changed dramatically. The column collapsed, unable to sustain its own weight, and pyroclastic surges began to race down the mountain's slopes. These surges were clouds of superheated gas and ash moving at tremendous speed with temperatures of several 100 degrees Celsius. The first surge didn't reach Pompeii, but the second one, arriving around 1 a.m., did. The surge that hit Pompeii wasn't as hot or as fast as the ones that struck Herculaneum, but it was deadly nonetheless. The superheated gas asphyxiated anyone who breathed it, while the force of the surge collapsed walls and buildings. Most of the people who died in Pompeii died in this moment, killed instantly by heat shock or asphyxiation. Their bodies buried under the continuing ashfall that would eventually bury the entire city under 6 to 7 meters of volcanic material. Walking through Pompeii today, you see evidence of this disaster everywhere. In the Garden of the Fugitives, plaster casts show a group of people who died together while trying to flee. The casts were made by a brilliant technique pioneered by archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli in the 1860s. When excavators encountered cavities in the hardened ash, they realized these cavities were the spaces left by bodies that had decomposed over the centuries. by pouring liquid plaster into these cavities, they could create casts that captured the exact forms of the victims at the moment of death. The casts are haunting. You can see the victims' postures, some curled in fetal positions as if trying to protect themselves, some reaching out as if for help, some lying flat as if they died while trying to run. You can see the folds in their clothing, the sandals on their feet, even facial features preserved in extraordinary detail. One cast shows a woman with her arm raised to shield her face. Another shows a small child, the body small and vulnerable, reaching toward what might have been a parent. These casts transform the eruption from an abstract historical event into a deeply personal tragedy. These were real people with real lives, people who had woken up that morning not knowing it would be their last, who had made choices and plans that would never be fulfilled, who died in terror and confusion, victims of forces beyond their control or understanding. In other parts of the city, more casts tell different stories. In the forum's granary, which now serves as a storage area for archaeological finds, more than a dozen casts are displayed, each one a person or animal caught by the eruption. There's a dog, its body twisted in the agony of death, still wearing its collar with studs. There are adults and children, the wealthy and the poor, all rendered equal by disaster. Some of the casts show people who were already dead from the ashfall before the pyroclastic surge arrived, their bodies covered and preserved where they fell. Others show people who were trying to shelter in buildings when the surge struck, dying instantly from the superheated air. And some show people in the streets or open areas trying to flee or find shelter, their last moments preserved in plaster for us to witness 2,000 years later. The eruption continued for several more hours after the surge that killed most of Pompeii's remaining inhabitants, with additional surges and continued ashfall burying the city deeper and deeper. By the time the eruption finally ended, Pompeii was buried under 6 to 7 meters of ash and pumice. The city completely disappeared beneath a grey wasteland that would remain undisturbed for nearly 17 centuries. The Romans knew what had happened. Pliny the Younger's letters described the eruption in vivid detail, including the death of his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who had sailed across the bay to help evacuate people and to observe the eruption more closely. But Pompeii itself was gone, its location gradually forgotten as the landscape changed and new communities grew up in the region. It wasn't until the late 16th century that the ruins were rediscovered accidentally during the construction of a water channel. Serious excavation didn't begin until the mid-18th century, and it's been continuing ever since, slowly revealing the city that Vesuvius buried and preserved. Standing among the ruins, looking at the casts of the victims, seeing the layers of volcanic material still visible in the unexcavated areas, you're confronted with the reality of volcanic disaster in a way that no amount of reading could convey. The mountain that dominates the landscape, beautiful in the morning light, is also a killer. It destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum and Stabiae and Oplontis, and it could do so again. Mount Vesuvius, the sleeping giant. From almost everywhere in Pompeii, you can see Vesuvius. The mountain dominates the northern skyline, its distinctive profile marking the spot where the summit was blown away by the eruption of 79 AD. The current height is about 1,281 meters above sea level, but before the eruption, it was significantly higher, perhaps another 100 meters or more. Looking at the mountain from the Forum, you see how it was deliberately incorporated into the city's visual and spiritual geography. The Temple of Jupiter, positioned at the northern end of the Forum, aligns perfectly with the mountain, framing it in a way that seems to acknowledge its power and importance. The ancient Pompeians would have seen the mountain every day, its slopes green with vegetation, its shape familiar and comforting in its permanence. Before the eruption of 79 AD, Vesuvius had been dormant for so long that the Romans didn't even recognize it as a volcano. Ancient writers describe the mountain's slopes as covered with vineyards and farms, places of fertility and abundance. The volcanic soil was rich in minerals that made excellent growing conditions for grapes, olives, and other crops. The wine produced from Vesuvian grapes was famous, known as Vesuvinum, and it was mentioned with approval by Roman writers. There had been warnings, though the Pompeians didn't recognize them as such. The earthquake of 62 AD was almost certainly related to magma movement beneath Vesuvius, the mountain's internal pressures building toward the eventual eruption. The small tremors that preceded the eruption were another warning, signs that something was changing beneath the earth. A fresco found in a Pompeian house shows Vesuvius as it appeared before the eruption, and it's revealing. The mountain is shown with a single peak, unlike the broken summit we see today. The slopes are green and cultivated, and at the base of the mountain, the god Bacchus is depicted presiding over grapevines, emphasizing the agricultural bounty that the mountain's fertile slopes provided. After the eruption, Vesuvius remained active, erupting multiple times over the following centuries. Historical records document eruptions in 203 AD, 472, 512, and many others throughout the medieval period and into modern times. The most recent eruption was in 1944, during World War II, when Allied forces occupying the area witnessed the mountain's power firsthand. Today, Vesuvius is carefully monitored by volcanologists using sophisticated equipment that can detect the slightest changes in seismic activity, ground deformation, or gas emissions. The mountain is considered one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world, not because it's particularly large or powerful by global standards, but because of the millions of people who live in its shadow. The metropolitan area of Naples, which includes numerous smaller towns and cities, has a population exceeding 3 million people, many of them living well within the range of a major eruption. The Italian government has developed extensive evacuation plans for the area around Vesuvius, designating the entire region within 7 kilometers of the crater as a red zone that would need to be evacuated in the event of an eruption. The plans call for evacuating 600,000 people within 72 hours, a logistical challenge that would be complicated by the panic and chaos that would inevitably accompany such an event. Looking at Vesuvius from Pompeii, knowing what the mountain did and knowing that it will almost certainly do it again someday, you feel a complex mixture of awe and unease. The mountain is beautiful in the late morning light. Its slopes now green again with vegetation that has reclaimed the lava flows and ash deposits of past eruptions. White clouds drift past its summit, and birds circle in the air currents created by the mountain's topography. But it's also a reminder of human vulnerability, of the fact that for all our technology and knowledge, for all our ability to monitor and predict and plan, we're still at the mercy of forces that dwarf our power to control them. The people of Pompeii lived in the shadow of this mountain for centuries without knowing the danger. And when the mountain finally erupted, there was nothing they could do to stop it or escape its effects. The relationship between Vesuvius and the modern communities around it is complex. The mountain is part of the regional identity, featured on tourist materials and local products, a source of pride and identity for people who live in its shadow. The fertile volcanic soil continues to support agriculture, particularly vineyards that produce wines with distinctive mineral qualities that wine enthusiasts prize. The mountain is also a tourist attraction in its own right, with hundreds of thousands of people hiking to the crater rim each year to peer into the smoking vent and marvel at the views across the Bay of Naples. But there's also fear and awareness of the danger. Everyone who lives here knows the history, knows what happened to Pompeii and Herculaneum, knows that the mountain could erupt again. Schools conduct evacuation drills. Emergency plans are reviewed and updated regularly. Scientific monitoring continues constantly, looking for any sign that the mountain's long sleep might be ending. The last significant seismic crisis occurred in 1984, when increased seismic activity and ground deformation suggested that magma might be moving beneath the mountain. The Italian government seriously considered ordering evacuations, but after several tense weeks, the activity subsided without an eruption. It was a reminder that the mountain is still alive, still capable of waking and wreaking havoc. Standing in Pompeii, looking at Vesuvius, you understand in a visceral way the relationship between human civilization and natural forces. We build our cities and conduct our lives with a kind of necessary optimism, assuming that tomorrow will be like today, that the ground beneath our feet is stable, that the sky above won't rain fire and ash. Most of the time, this optimism is justified. Most of the time, tomorrow is like today, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes the ground does shake, the sky does darken, and everything we've built and planned for is swept away in an instant. Pompeii is a monument to those moments, a frozen testament to the day when everything changed, when the mountain that had been such a benign presence for so long revealed its true nature. As the morning light grows stronger on Vesuvius's slopes, highlighting the textures and colors of the volcanic landscape, you feel grateful to be here, to have seen Pompeii in this special light, to have walked these streets and touched these walls and stood in these spaces. But you also feel a deep sadness for all those who lived here, who loved and worked and worshipped and dreamed in this place, only to have it all taken away in a day. The mountain stands silent now, beautiful and terrible, a reminder of both creation and destruction, of the forces that shape our world and our inability to control them. Reflections and closing. The morning has fully arrived now. The soft light of dawn has given way to the clear, strong illumination of late morning. The air is warm, approaching hot, and the stones beneath your feet radiate heat. The site is no longer empty. Tour groups are arriving, their multilingual chatter filling the air. Guards are at their posts. Vendors are setting up shops near the entrances. The daily routine of modern Pompeii is beginning. But you've had your time, those precious hours at dawn, when the city belonged to you and the ghosts, when you could walk these streets in relative solitude and feel the weight of history without the distraction of crowds. That experience, that connection to the past, is something you'll carry with you. Walking back toward the exit, passing through the Via dell'Abbondanza one last time, you reflect on what Pompeii means, why this place has such power to move and fascinate people nearly 2,000 years after its destruction. Part of it is certainly the preservation, the extraordinary completeness with which the eruption captured a moment in time. But it's more than that. Pompeii speaks to something fundamental about the human condition, about the fragility of our lives and the impermanence of everything we build and value. The Pompeians were people much like us, with similar hopes and fears, similar desires for security and comfort and meaning. They built a city that was sophisticated and beautiful, that provided for their material needs and their spiritual aspirations. They created art and architecture that still moves us 2 millennia later. They developed social structures and institutions that allowed thousands of people to live together in relative harmony and prosperity. And it all ended in a day. The houses they built, the businesses they operated, the temples they worshipped in, the streets they walked, all of it buried under ash and forgotten. The people themselves, killed by a mountain that had seemed so benign, their final moments preserved in plaster casts that allow us to witness their death throes across the span of 2,000 years. There's a profound lesson in this about the relationship between human ambition and natural forces. We build our civilizations with such confidence, such certainty, that we can control and shape the world to our needs. And in many ways, we can. The Romans built aqueducts that brought water across miles of difficult terrain. They engineered roads that connected distant provinces. They created a system of law and government that maintained order across a vast empire. They achieved things that were remarkable then and remain impressive today. But Vesuvius didn't care about any of that. The mountain followed its own geological imperatives, building pressure over centuries until it had to release it. And when it did, all the architecture and art and law and engineering counted for nothing. The mountain buried it all indiscriminately, the grand villas and the humble shops, the temples and the taverns, the forum where public life unfolded and the private gardens where families relaxed. Yet there's also something hopeful in Pompeii's story. The eruption destroyed the city, but it also preserved it. And that preservation has given us an invaluable window into the ancient world. We know more about daily life in Roman times because of Pompeii than we would otherwise ever have known. The completeness of the archaeological record, the ability to see not just grand public buildings, but ordinary houses, not just formal art, but casual graffiti, has immeasurably enriched our understanding of ancient civilization. And there's something moving about the way Pompeii connects us to those ancient people. When you read their graffiti, when you see the wear patterns on their streets, when you look at the plaster casts of their bodies, you're not encountering abstract history or distant ancestors. You're encountering people who are fundamentally like you, who experienced the same range of emotions, who worried about the same kinds of things, who loved and feared and hoped with the same intensity. The merchant who worried about his business competing with the shop next door, the teenager who carved his name into a wall to declare his love for someone, the mother who cradled her child as the mountain erupted and the world ended around them. These people speak to us across time in a way that's immediate and personal. Their lives, so completely different from ours in their details, were remarkably similar in their essentials. As you pass through the exit gate, leaving the archaeological site behind, you turn for one last look. The ruins spread out before you, the standing columns and broken walls, the streets and houses and public buildings, all of it bathed in the strong late morning light. Vesuvius rises in the background, its slopes green and peaceful, beautiful in the Italian sun. You know you'll remember this experience, these hours walking through Pompeii at dawn, for the rest of your life. The quality of the early light on ancient stones, the silence of empty streets that once rang with Roman voices, the sense of connection to people long dead whose city lives on in these ruins, the awareness of time's passage and the impermanence of all things, combined paradoxically with the evidence of continuity and endurance. Pompeii was destroyed, but it wasn't erased. It's still here, still teaching us, still moving us with its beauty and its tragedy. As long as people care about history, as long as we're curious about how others have lived and died, as long as we're capable of being moved by the evidence of ancient lives lived with the same intensity and purpose that we bring to our own lives, Pompeii will continue to matter. The city sleeps now, preserved in volcanic ash, waiting for each new dawn to bring new visitors who will walk its streets and marvel at what they find. And each visitor who takes the time to really see it, to really feel it, to connect with the humanity that echoes through these ruins, becomes part of Pompeii's continuing story, part of the chain of memory and appreciation that ensures these ancient lives won't be forgotten. As you walk away, the modern world reasserts itself. The sound of traffic, the sight of contemporary buildings, the awareness of your own time and place, pulling you back from your communion with the past. But part of you remains in those ancient streets, walking in the cool of dawn, listening for the echoes of Roman footsteps, feeling the connection across time that makes places like Pompeii so precious and so important. If you've enjoyed this journey through ancient Pompeii, if these quiet hours wandering through history have brought you some peace or wonder or connection to the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue creating these immersive historical experiences, these opportunities to visit extraordinary places and times through the gentle medium of storytelling, designed to help you relax and perhaps drift peacefully off to sleep. Thank you for walking with me through Pompeii at dawn. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed and ready for whatever your own day brings. Sleep well.